decirlo, en el campo de la música, del pensamiento, de la tecnología, y visita por primera vez Buenos Aires. Y realmente era una emoción verlo transitar estos pasillos supervisando personalmente la instalación de sus 2 muestras. Es la primera vez que en un mismo centro se pueden disfrutar 77 y The Chic. Y esta visita sin duda es el comienzo de una tarea en conjunta en la que han participado el British Council, a quien quiero agradecer, a Lumen, a Mariela Gerey, que se presta a ser la moderadora con todo su conocimiento, y por supuesto agradecerles a todos ustedes que están aquí presentes. Señores y señoras, con ustedes, Brian Eno.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Up there too? Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I'm sure I would love you as well if I knew who you were. Unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish very well, but there is a very good translator who will help you.
Yes. So, Brian, there are a lot of questions from people.
Any questions?
Many questions that people send through Twitter, Facebook, and I have a first question, and it's more about the work, about social issues, and I wonder how can art and culture could change our way of thinking and contribute to global society in these times, which are quite difficult times.
Okay. Many of the questions that people asked concern this issue of what can artists do now at this point in time, at this very strange point in time, when it seems like many of the revolutions of the last 60 or 100 years have been suddenly put into reverse. Well, the first thing I would say is that art is always political. There is no such thing as non-political art. And I want to explain that a little bit. Of course, if you write a song that says, smash the capitalist system, that's clearly a political piece of art. But it might not be the most interesting political piece of art. When you look at the social structure that makes a piece of art, sorry, I'm a little bit close to feedback here, sound man. Can you just turn me down just a little? Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. You want me louder? Okay, well, it's a little problem for the sound guy because if he makes me much louder, I feed back, you see. And if I feed back, I stop talking. I should speak clearly and very loud. Okay, let's think of the great musical art of the 18th century, the orchestra, as an example of a piece of political art. Now, you might say, how is an orchestra political? What I would say is that the structure of an orchestra, that's to say the hierarchical levels involved in an orchestra, the flow of control from the top to the bottom and not the other way, is a political statement. An orchestra is a statement about how things work and about how things come into being. And it's a typical statement of the 18th century. The same statement is found in the way armies were organised and in the way the church was organised. They were also hierarchical, layered structures like that. So it doesn't have to be in the music itself. The politics is in the structure that makes the music. And in that sense, if you contrast an orchestra, which is a hierarchy of individuals who've all been trained to do two things. One is to be able to play music according to a set of instructions, but the other is to subdue their own personal eccentricities, if you like. You do not want a second violin player who suddenly decides to throw in a little improvisation of his own in the middle of a Beethoven symphony. The point of orchestral music is to try to make individuals as similar to each other as possible. That's a political statement. Similarly with the army, the point of an army is not to have a bunch of gifted geniuses. It's to have a bunch of people who will follow orders identically, if possible. So those are both political statements. Now contrast that with, for example, a rock band. You know, a typical four-piece where you have a guy who can play guitar, another guy who can just about play the drums, somebody who's got the bass because actually he owned a van and the band needed somebody to drive them around. This is often how people end up being bass players in bands. It doesn't mean that they're bad. But what I'm trying to say is that a rock band, by definition, is a group of people of mixed competence. They aren't all geniuses, very rarely anyway. They're mixed competence and they're expected to be individuals. That's the whole point, that they should be different from one another. So the chemistry of one particular band, you know, the Rolling Stones, as opposed to another band, let's say, Arctic Monkey or whatever, is to do with the differences between those people, not the similarities. So that's a political statement as well. It's a different kind of view of how things are made, what is necessary for humans to cooperate together. So as we move through this quite difficult time in our history, what I find myself looking for is examples of new kinds of cooperation. You know, societies only really are held together by two kinds of ideas. One is hope. The hope that together we would make something great and new. This was the hope that kept America going until last week. And it's the hope that kept the EU going until last summer. You know, the EU was a hope that by cooperating together we could build a new future together. So hope is one of the ways that societies hold together. The other way they hold together is fear. And that's the card that's being played now. Fear is a very easy tool for politicians to use, especially when they have media as stupid as the media we have now, because it's a good story. Fear is always a good story, it always sells papers. You know, you have to remember that we come from thousands of generations of humans, our ancestors, who survived because they were frightened. They survived because they paid attention to danger. That is so deeply built into human beings to be aware of danger that anybody wanting to sell newspapers or make shit television programs just has to keep playing that same card over and over. So, of course, it's very divisive. It breaks societies up. It says That one's your friend, but that one's your enemy. So get together with your friend and get rid of the enemy. And unfortunately, we're seeing that happening now. So somebody talking over there.
Yes, in that context, in this context, how do you think that the art would reverse the situation? Is there any way to contribute for the reversion of the situation, or is just...
Well, it's a big struggle. No, I don't think it's useless. I have this idea that what is possible in art becomes thinkable in life. So if you see something happening in art and you think, that's great, that makes your life possibilities different. Because you then start to think, could it be like that in life? To give you an example, in the 1850s, I think it was, an American woman called Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a very famous book, which was called Uncle Tom's Cabin. That book probably was the biggest artistic contribution to the fight against slavery in America. You probably all know about Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's always made fun of because the black man, Uncle Tom, who's the hero of it, is such a sort of idealized white person's dream of what a black person should be. He's always smiling and he's very friendly and not at all threatening. Nonetheless, I think that book really changed the way the whole society thought about black people, because it showed this man as having the same feelings, the same fears, the same hopes as the white people, as you and me. So suddenly, reading this book, people started to consider the possibility that these black people that they were using as slaves might actually be the same kind of people. Well, as soon as you think that, it's very difficult to carry on treating them badly. It's enlarged the circle of empathy. Charles Dickens did the same thing in England, writing about the poor people of East London. So in literary arts, I think it's very possible that you can change the way people think about the present and the future. There's a play in London at the moment, which is written by a group of refugees. These are people who were in those, I don't know if you know about them, but they're in these camps on the coast of France, people trying to get to England. Of course, the English government stops them coming. So somebody got a few of these refugees and they wrote a play together. The play is changing the way people see refugees. It's impossible to go to that play and leave with the same arrogance that the British have treated the refugees so far. Arrogance is our biggest national export, by the way. We sell those of them.
This concept you developed in some of your texts. For me, it's a fascinating concept, the concept of surrender. I wonder if this function of the art is related to the concept of surrender. And what do you think about following the flow? Can we follow the flow, be a surrender, and at the same time change the actual situation, the present situation? Is it possible to mix both?
Well, it's a good question. So, I talk about surrender a lot because I think surrender is not a passive activity. I think surrender is an active verb. So, my best analogy for this is thinking about people surfing. When you're surfing, what you're doing is quickly moving between control. So it takes control to get onto the top of the wave, and then you let the wave carry you. Then you take control again, and then you let the wave carry you. You need both of those abilities. You need a whole range of possibilities from pure surrender to total control. And I think throughout your life, if you live a reasonably healthy life, you're constantly moving along that axis back and forth as the situation requires. So if you can't do that, if you're not capable of surrendering, you'll break very quickly. Another interesting analogy of this is with the ships. In the 16th and 17th century, when we started making big wooden ships, the type that led the British to conquer most of the world, those ships were designed to be able to surrender. They weren't stiff, they weren't rigid, they could flex. So on a big ship, there were about 30 people constantly throwing water out of the ship, because the ships had to be flexible in order to survive in the ocean. So the ships had to be able to surrender, essentially. When they started making metal ships, of course, they broke. It took a long time to learn how to make rigid ships. So anyway, back to the idea of surrender. Sorry, I'm talking about ships because I've got a show on the ship. I love ships. When we come from generations of humans who've been increasingly good at controlling the world. You know, the fact that we're all here is a tribute to our ability to control things. You've come from all over the place. I've come from the other side of the planet. All sorts of complicated technical inventions are involved in making this event happen tonight. I mean, just look at your computer there. How many millions of people contributed to the making of that? How many millions of people contributed to me getting here today? Not only the guy who controlled the plane, but the people who designed it, and the people who designed the infrastructure of travel, and the banks, and the travel agents, so on and so on. So we're very proud of the fact that we control so much. We're very good at controlling. Primitive people weren't as good at controlling. They weren't as technically skilled. So they had to be much better at surrendering. If you can't control, you better know how to surrender. And to surrender means to actually flow with something. So when something happens, if you can't ride it, you have to know how to float on it, essentially. And I think surrender is a great and very underrated human gift. And one of the things I want to do when I make work is to show people what the pleasure of surrender is. I mean, we all know surrendering. We do it all the time. We do it with sex, we do it with drugs, we do it with art, and we do it with religion. Those are the areas of life where we take pleasure in surrendering. But we don't normally use the word there. That's what we're doing when we say, oh God, it completely took me over, or I lost control, or all those things you say when something great happens to you. They're all to do with surrendering. So I think, to relate this to your question about society and where we are now, we will have to learn when is the right time to surrender and when is the right time to act. And what we also have to learn is that complaining is not political action. You know, what happened in the last few months is that everybody thought that sending angry tweets to each other about Donald Trump or about Brexit was the same as political action. It isn't. Social media is not political action. It might feel nice, it might feel really good to say things like Donald Trump is a big orange arsehole. But it doesn't make any fucking difference. If you want to do something, go out and do it. Don't just bloody tweet about it. There's a very interesting graph by Joseph Stiglitz in one of his books. Joseph Stiglitz was a Nobel economist. He shows a graph of productivity since the war, so I'm drawing a graph from your point of view. So productivity from 1945 to 2015 goes up in a pretty straight line. Workers' wages followed it quite closely until about 1978. And then workers' wages, so this graph, productivity is going up, workers' wages suddenly flatline. They go further and further away from And then they start to turn down. In the last 16 years, the wages for working people have actually decreased in real terms. So you have two things. You first of all have people who are actually worse off, looking at people who are so much better off that it must constantly make them furious. You know, how all that extra profit, where did it go? It didn't go to the working people, so it went to the people at the top. Joseph Stiglitz made the point that last year, the 62 people at the top of the wealth structure in the world owned half of the world's wealth. 62 people. 62 people who put them in one fucking bus and then push it over a cliff. One busload of people own the same as 3.5 million people. This is crazy. It's got to be a bad formula. Apart from anything else, how can you spend that much money? You know, you just get so bored with it. I've got to buy another fucking watch. Another yacht. This is an interesting question because I studied painting, actually. That was, like many English musicians, I went to art school. And I went to a very interesting art school. It was very experimental. So one of the things they had at the art school, though it was a very small school, they had a small, sort of a basic music studio. And I started playing around with tape recorders there. And I remember having this crisis in my life when I was 18 or 19, thinking, what shall I do? Shall I do art or shall I do music? And I really, really liked both of them. I loved doing both of them. And I couldn't see any way of bringing them together. It seemed an impossible project. When I left art college, I joined a band, and for the first couple of years in that band, well, I was only in that band for 2 years actually, I was thinking, when am I going to get back to doing art again? That was a sort of thought in the back of my mind. And then I started thinking, what do I really like about paintings? What is it I like about paintings? Why am I so excited about paintings? And I thought, I like the fact that they're still, that they don't move, that they stay in one place and they stay there forever. And I started to think, I wonder if you could make music that was like that. Instead of making a piece of music where you have beginning, and then a section B, and then a bit of section A, and then section C, and then a loud part, and then a quiet bit, and then the thing ends. You know, a little story like that. I thought, what about if you made music that was just like light? So it was just something that was in a room all the time. It was just a sort of emotional condition of some kind. So I started making, in the early 70s actually, I started making what I thought of as sonic art, sound painting, I used to call it. It was a good expression because I was doing this entirely in the recording process. I can't play anything. I don't have any skills in terms of keys or this or that. What I can play is a recording studio. That's really my instinct. And I had discovered by the late 60s that you could make music in the same way you make paintings. Colour, you put it on, you look at it for a bit, and then you put another one on and make a shape there, and then you take the first one off, and then you change the second one. It's just like making a painting. It's nothing like performing music. Performing music, which is what people imagine you do in a recording studio, is what hardly anybody does in a recording studio. You know, it's very, very unusual now for a band to walk into a studio, stand in front of microphones and play. It doesn't happen really. What happens much more is that music is created by this new synthetic process, which is like painting. It's like painting in sound. And so I started to realize that I was actually still thinking like a painter, but I was turning the results into sound. Now, at the same time, when I was at art college, I'd been playing with light, making these little sculptures with light. And I was in the studio once with Talking Heads, working on one of their albums, I can't remember which one. And in the studio next door were a band called Foreigner. Do you remember Foreigner? I want to know what love is. That song. And one day, the roadie from Foreigner ran into the studio and he looked very nervous. He had a box with him, and in the box was a video camera. Now, this was in the mid-70s. I'd never seen a video camera before. And it was a big, clunky little thing. And he said, does anyone want to buy it? I said, yeah, I'll buy it. I didn't really know what to do with it. But I bought it anyway, and I took it home. I was living in West 8th Street in Manhattan. I took it home, and it was a funny shape. It had a kind of curved bottom, so I couldn't make it stand up. And I didn't have a tripod. So I had to lay it down sideways like that.
That's good.
Yeah. And I was looking at the TV. It was like this. Changing the colour control. It had very radical colour controls. It's called an industrial camera. I don't know what that means, but it meant that you could saturate the whole thing with pure blood red or ice blue or whatever. And I'm turning like this. I thought, why don't I just turn the television over? So I took the television and I turned it that way up. And I thought, wow, that's painting now. And suddenly it was like I had discovered a completely new medium. Video used to make pictures, not to tell stories, not to give you the weather forecast or tell you the news or tell you what some wanker in Hollywood was doing. Wanker is an English word meaning masturbator. Better translator, I'm not sure. She seems such a wholesome person, I'm not sure. Anyway, so I turned this thing over. And then I suddenly realized the biggest problem that I had faced as a light artist was solved. Because the problem with working with light in the late 60s and the early 70s was that it was the most clumsy technology you could imagine. It was hopeless. It really was very difficult. Suddenly I had this device where I could completely control the colour at any point on a surface like that. So anyway, that's a long story. But but it meant I started getting back into painting again, but using televisions, essentially. And then everything I did after that, some of which is showing up there. Is it up there? The lamp hour? The grand lamp hour? It's up there. So, is it?
Yeah, it's up there.
It's up there.
Yeah.
That all came out of that single idea that television was not a storytelling machine. A television was a picture-making machine. And I still think this idea has not been fully absorbed by the world's television channels yet. I am surprised that I still switch on the television and see people telling stories instead of seeing beautiful paintings. This will change.
For that story, I didn't know that. I really like that work, and actually I had it in my living room many years ago on the television.
It's a good way to use television.
And I didn't know that story is so important. But that work is very related, I think it's related to the concept of landscape. How and I think that landscape is not only related to your visual work, but also to your sound work. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I grew up listening to pop music and some other things, that essentially listening to songs. Now, the structure of songs is another political statement. You have one person at the front who has the microphone, who uses the words, who does all of the high definition stuff. Then you get all these other guys in the back, and the spotlight isn't on, basically. Unless occasionally they get given a solo, and the roadie remembers to switch on the light so the drummer gets seen looking at it. And then the light goes off again, it's back to the lead singer. So, most of popular music is based around the idea that there's a central figure, a focal figure, the singer, and the singer has something important to tell you, a song. He's got to tell you that he loves her, or she doesn't love him, or whatever his important message is. He has to tell you that, so he needs a big microphone. Well, in the 60s I started listening to records where two things were happening. First, the singer was getting more and more buried in the music. So that picture of a pyramid with the singer at the top started to flatten out. I started listening to African music, where suddenly there's a whole web of people doing things, and one of them is the singer. He's not so important. He doesn't appear much of the time. You know, I was listening to Fela Kuti, where Fela might sing for 2 minutes in a 15-minute piece. So the singer started to disappear there. And the other thing that started to happen is that people started to create sonic worlds where the voice was not the center of it. The best example of that was that beautiful song by My Bloody Valentine. I forgot the name of the song now. My Bloody Valentine. It's a song where you can hardly hear the voice. It's lost in a sea of distortion. It's just... Sorry? Thank you. Good man, thank you. So this sense of a collapse of that old pyramid of the singer at the top started to fascinate me. But what also started to happen was that people started to lose the sense of where the edge of the music was. If you listen to Phil Spector, for instance, his great production technique was essentially that he blurred everything. You know, if you have 4 pianos playing the the same thing together. And 4 string orchestras, and 3 drummers, that kind of thing. The effect of that is that you lose precision. You get a soft focus. You lose the edge of the music. It doesn't have the crisp definition any longer. And this really fascinated me, the idea that you could make a music which kind of faded off at the edges into reality. So I kind of started to think, imagine if you could make a kind of music where you couldn't tell where the edge of the music was. Is that stuff I'm hearing out there, is that traffic? Is it birds? Is it something in the music? Is it out on the street? So I started to think about making music as a form of landscape painting, of trying to make a landscape which, like a landscape painting, has a horizon, that you know there's something on the other side of the horizon. You know it's there, you just can't see it. I wanted that feeling that you knew there was something over the edge of the music, you just couldn't hear it. So I started then thinking about what should be the role of the voice in this. What does the voice have to do with this? And this led me to the album My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, where instead of me singing, I kind of imagined the music as a sort of trap that would catch a voice, some voice that was flying through the air at the time. I got nearly all those voices off the radio. I had just moved to New York and I was very lonely. And I would sit at home listening to that great miracle of the late 20th century, American radio. It was astonishing to me, coming from England where we only had the BBC, which was all very proper. To switch on the radio and hear people who were clearly insane and own radio stations. It was fantastic for me. It was like a magic box. Every time I tune in and I hear some insane preacher going on about getting the Jezebel spirit out of someone. I thought, fuck me, they're mad in this country. Really, it was fantastic. And there were all these voices that we never heard people like that in England. We thought they didn't exist until summer. We've only just discovered that we have our own version of these people. That they were being polite until now. Keep quiet. But suddenly, it was like opening up. You know when you lift a stone and there are ants underneath and they're all doing this, running everywhere. That was what it was like switching on the radio in New York. So I started recording all these voices and thinking, I don't need to sing. These people are much more interested than I am. Sorry, I keep going off the point. Ask me another question. allowing yourself to be a complete idiot. This is why it's very difficult to write a song with somebody else in the room. In the early stages, it can be really ugly. You just want to do it on your own. It's, you know that famous expression they say that politics is like sausages, you don't want to see it being made. Well, I feel the same way about music. I think music is like sausages as well. It's much better not to watch what goes into it. All those pieces of ears and testicles. So it has to be a very close relationship with somebody if you are going to allow them to see you putting testicles into the sausages. This could be a great quote.
Well, maybe the last
About
experience.
I just have to tell you a joke first, because I just suddenly remembered. But I don't know if it's a joke that would make much sense in Spanish. It goes like this. I've got two things to say to you. Bollocks. It's probably a little bit hard to translate. Sorry, you were going to ask me a much more serious question.
The collaboration and the experience of collaborating with other musicians I was in the last little bit about that. There were so many questions about that, so maybe it would be interesting to...
Okay, well, with Bowie, most of the time we were making jokes. So he was a very, very funny person. And very fast on his way. The funniest person I've ever met. And he had a particular kind of humour that was very cultured. He could draw a lot of different references. So he made me laugh, and I would make him laugh as well. And most of the time we were in the studio, we took on the role of two famous English comedy characters called Pete and Doug. Now, I won't even try to tell you about Pete and Doug because it would make no sense at all to anyone who wasn't English. They were two working class English guys. And I thought, what is Now, this is a very good example of the sausages thing because I'm sure what you were hoping I would say is that we went into the studio and we sat there like this. With tears. No, we didn't. It was serious fun. It was really serious fun. We used to joke all the time. And we didn't really argue because there was no place for arguing in the joke characters we set up. we used to use the oblique strategies a lot. I had this deck of cards, which I made in the 70s with a painter friend of mine called Peter Schmidt. Shall I go into a little detail about this? Thank you. But I better explain them a little bit to people who don't know about it. Okay, so when the first album we made as Roxy Music, which was the first band I was in, we were working under a lot of pressure. The studio was very expensive, we had a small budget. So we were working very, very fast. And sometimes I would leave the studio in the evening and I'd be walking home. I think, I forgot everything I had learned because the pressure was so much. I stopped thinking. So I thought, how can I remind myself to keep thinking, even though I'm working under pressure? So I started making a list of little ideas to remind myself of. And the first idea on the list was like one of the 10 Commandments. It said, honor thy error as a hidden intention. So to translate that into more modern English, it means don't think of things as a mistake. If something happens that you didn't expect, take it seriously and look at it. Now, I do this all the time in my normal life, but when I was under pressure in the recording studio with the clock ticking and the money going out the door, I forgot to do that. So I had this sitting on the mixing desk, I had honor thy error as a hidden intention. I thought, good, that will solve the problem. And then I thought, there's a few other things like that I should remember. So I started making a list of ideas like that. One of them said, leave the room and listen from outside. Because I always noticed that when I went to the toilet, I came back, before I got into the studio, before I opened the door, I would hear the music in a different way from when I was standing inside the room. I would always hear some aspect of structure I hadn't noticed. Usually the drummer. There's a few jokes about drummers. What's the definition of a pop band? 3 musicians and a drummer. Anyway, I love drummers. That's what the drummer was saying. I love drummers. Anyway, I ended up with this list of about 20 of these things. And of course, having a list is no good at all because you don't read lists when you're working. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll put those onto cards. So I got some cards and I wrote a thing on each card. And then when we were working, when everything's got a little bit stuck, I just pull a card out and it would say something like breathe more deeply. Okay. And I found this worked very well. It was a very good way of just changing your focus briefly so that suddenly you would step aside and then you would look back at what you're doing from a different position. So I was discussing this with my friend Peter Schmidt, the painter, and I said, Peter, I've been doing this thing in cars. And he said, oh, Christ. He said, look at this. He pulled out a book. He'd been doing exactly the same thing. He had a book with separate pages or something. So anyway, we put them together and we made this pack of cards called the Oblique Strategies, which are still published. They've been going for 41 years now. And a lot of people use them. David and I use them a lot. David Bowie. I still use them, yeah, for fun. They make the thing fun. They suddenly take you out of that self-obsession obsessed place you can get into for working. For instance, when I was working with David, we used to start a track with pulling a card each and not telling each other what our cards are. And then we would start working on something. And it was a very interesting game because sometimes we would be working on quite different projects. For instance, I remember one day he pulled the card, we discovered later, he pulled the card that says, change nothing and continue with immaculate consistency. And I pulled the card that said, destroy the most important thing. And so we're both working with it, and he keeps putting it back in his place. And from that came the song on here is called Sense That. Well, no, it's here, it's on low. It's on low, isn't it? I can't remember. It's on one of those records. But that was a good example of a constructive and funny game. I'm sure you don't want to know about this. You want to know that we cried and sweat and went home and dashed our heads against the wall and read lots of Proust or something like that. We didn't read any Proust.
And variable system model. And I know it is quite a complex question, but
okay. How are we doing for time?
5 minutes.
This should not take any longer than 2 hours.
If you want, we can
No. I can probably get through it in 1 hour and 55 minutes. I'll just speak a little faster. No, the question is about a scientist called Stafford Beer, who was a friend of mine and quite a big influence on my work. So Stafford Beer was a cybernetician. Cybernetics is the science of systems. And cybernetics is what grew into chaos theory and what grew into now called complexity theory. So cybernetics is, in a sense, for me, the most interesting conceptual thread of science in the late 20th century. Because it's really a different understanding of knowledge itself. Anyway, Stafford Beer wrote a book in the early 70s called The Brain of the Firm. And it was about the structure of organizations. In fact, what I started talking about this evening. It's about how organizations are structured, what mechanisms hold them together, what mechanisms break them apart, and so on and so on. This book was the first thing I had read that, to me, said something relevant about modern music. Music critics had said nothing to me about music. Music critics generally write about words. That seems to be the least important part of music. What I was interested in was structures and systems, not whether somebody's guitar sounded like Jimi Hendrix, or how many times they told their girlfriend they loved them. This just didn't seem at all interesting. So I was looking for some structural explanation of the kind of music I was becoming interested in, which was not only pop music, but things like Terry Riley, for example. And in particular, I was interested in the idea that it would be possible to write music in an entirely new and different way. Now, to give you an example of that, Terry Riley wrote a piece in the early 60s in C. It's, to me, one of the most magical pieces of music, partly because of the way it works. In C has only 52 bars. Each bar is a very small arrangement of notes in the key of C, in a particular rhythm in the key of C. So you can get any group of people to play this. You can have an accordion player, saxophone, 3 singers, a trombonist, a harp player, or you can have 4 saxophone players, 2 violins, 11 electric organs, whatever. Any group of instruments can play this piece. And the rules are very simple. I'm sorry this is a bit loud, but you have to hear this to understand what's so revolutionary about it. The rules are very simple. Everybody starts together. There's a pulse. Pulse stays throughout the piece. So everybody starts playing bar 1. So they're all in sync for bar 1. Whatever bar 1 is, then any musician, when they feel like it, moves on to bar 2. So all the others are still playing bar 1. Now somebody is playing bar 2 at the same time. Then somebody else moves to bar 2, then somebody else does, then this one moves to bar 3, and so on and so on. So gradually, the music starts to thicken up as more and more different bars are being played together. And it takes this amazingly beautiful kaleidoscopic quality, and then reaches maximum density. Everyone's playing a different bar. And then the rule is everybody has to end up in the same bar. So the piece goes from unison to multiple polyphony back to unison. Now, every time you hear this piece, of course, it's different. Because people choose to move at different times, it's different instruments. So every time this piece is a new piece of music. It's not like listening to Beethoven's Fifth a few times. It's different, completely different each time. And it's so economical. The whole score is on one piece of paper. I'm just let me finish this. So I was so impressed by this. Instead of, I started to think, instead of the composer building a sort of cathedral of sound, where they designed every piece, every stone in it, every stairway, every walkway, you know, the image of the symphony, of this cathedral of sound. Instead of that, this is like somebody designing a seed, and then planting that seed, and watching it grow into something. So this is another kind of surrender. This is the idea of the composer as somebody who starts something, not somebody who finishes something. And this, to me, was an absolute breakthrough. I mean, it wasn't, I didn't only realise it from that piece, there were others, like the Steve Wright pieces, but also the Velvet Underground as well. In all of those cases, I saw a different idea of what a composition was, what making something was. And to me, those ideas were very potent social ideas as well. So it gave rise to my feeling that the way we tended to think about politics was wrong. We were still thinking about politics from the 18th century composer idea. The idea that somebody at the top with all the brains designs the whole system and then everybody just does it. This approach, the Steve Wright approach, the Terry Riley approach, the garage band approach, if you like, was to start from the bottom and let the thing grow up. So that was the breakthrough. And what was the question? I forgot. Oh, there was Stafford Beer. Okay, yes. So I was looking for a language to think about this kind of process, this way of things coming into being. And the language that I found was in cybernetics. And there's this beautiful word in cybernetics, which she knew. She's almost the first person I've ever met who knew this word, which is the word autopoiesis. Autopoiesis means self-making. And this is what I thought I wanted to do. I wanted to make self-making things. So rather than design things in detail, I want to create seeds that would then come to life in ways that I didn't expect. Now, this big light piece I have here is an example of that. It never repeats. That isn't true. It will repeat in a few billion years. There's a good chance that in a few billion years the same thing will happen again. But effectively, I've never seen it repeat. So I've watched this thing now for years, and it keeps generating new things. And this fascinates me, that you could make something that is a surprise to the creator as it is to the audience. Jeez, I talk too much.
In the 60s, I was a conceptual artist because the little art college that I was at was very connected into Fluxus and the Scratch Orchestra and all of these things that were going on in the 60s, which were very conceptual. And I really liked it. I was very into the conceptual art thing. And then it went away, and I was quite surprised to see it emerge again in the 90s. It didn't seem so interesting the second time around. And now it's coming around for the third time, and it seems even less interesting. Hopefully I'll die before it comes around the fourth time. But I kind of thought conceptualism was a very important part in the history of art, and it belongs in the history of art. I don't want to see it being, I'm quite bored actually. I want things that physically change me. I want things that I have a visceral, physical relationship with. So, the beginning of understanding this was in 1975 I released a record called Discrete Music, which was the first ambient record really. Though I didn't have the name ambient then, I didn't come up with the word ambient for another 2 years. But the first ambient record was really Discrete Music. And I released that onto an ocean of neglect and indifference. And nobody seemed very interested at the time. And funnily enough, very interestingly, it was released the same week that Lou Reed released Metal Machine Music. And Lou and I, when we got to know each other, were very interested in that fact, because there's sort of two extremes of the same musical idea. They're both about immersion. They're both about having a kind of endless, indistinguished field of music. And it's funny, they came out at the same time, the same year. Anyway, I was suddenly, it was 7, I was into this idea, as I said, of boundaryless music, endless music. You couldn't do that then. So I made the longest record I could make, which was 31 minutes on one side. But I had the idea of making music that could go on forever. So it would be like a painting, you put it on, it just sits there. Sometimes you pay attention to it, sometimes you ignore it. That was my notion. The point of the music is not just to be some sort of clever conceptual thing. I wanted music that changed the world for me, that made a different place, changed the way your mind was working. So, with that first one, Discrete Music did that to me. And then, about 2 years after that came out, I started meeting people who would say to me, I love that record because I find I can really write well. Or I love that record because I'm a designer and I find there's good music to have when I'm drawing. Something like that. And then I started meeting a lot of women, which I've always done, who would say to me, this is the music I had my first child to. And then I started, over the years, I started meeting kids who'd been born to this music. There were 2 hospitals in England that had that music in their maternity because they got good results. It was very calming. So I started to think, there's a good business in this. No, I don't actually think that. But I thought it was a success to make music people used in their lives. Now, people use music all the time. Use music to make you dance. Use music to make you cry. But I want to use music to give you a calmness, a place to think, a place that you could go to. Be like a room that you go into. You're now in that room, now you do this thing, that you write or you read or whatever. And since then, that's been my intention with these records. I've got a new one coming out in January called Reflection. And I call it Reflection because whenever I hear this new piece of music, I find myself thinking back over the things that happened and sort of trying to sort them out, put them in perspective with each other. So I call it Reflection. And I hope that it will be useful to other people in the same way. Now, I met somebody yesterday who told me something. Oh, yes, no, it's a friend of mine told me that the writer Ian Rankin He's an English, or Scottish actually, detective thriller writer. He only writes with my records. So you see, detective thrillers, now that's a bit different from alternatives. So I'm not just a one-shot wonder. I can do detective thrillers as well as ladies.
It's not only sound music, also with Eurovision culture. I read about paintings and maybe went back to the exhibitions.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of feeling with that visual artwork.
Well, it's quite interesting because these shows, you won't have seen this show yet, today. They are very, very slowly changing. They're very slow. You can't really see anything changing. It's only after a few minutes you realise that something's changed. So they have absolutely everything missing from them. If you try to sell this to a Hollywood director, you'd say, well, there's no story, there's no beginning, there's no focus, there's no words, there's no rhythm. There's nothing, none of the normal ingredients of what would be considered entertainment are in these pieces. And yet, people stay for hours and hours sometimes. People sometimes stay for 6 hours at these shows. And then they come back the following day for another 6 hours. I mean, I know there are a lot of homeless people in Buenos Aires. Sorry, that's not a very nice joke. But it's interesting to me that if you make something, it's the opposite of showbiz philosophy. You know, showbiz always assumes that to get an audience, you have to make things faster and louder and brighter and, more elegant, more amazing, more. And what I'm making is less and less and less and less. I make it as slow as I can make it. And that seems to be something that people really enjoy. I know. I mean, I always basically make work for myself. And then I think I'm not that different from everybody else. So if I like it, somebody else is going to like it. Well, with these pieces, it seems to be true. I think we should just do a couple more questions because I can see it's getting a bit boring for people sitting there. I can tell some more jokes.
In your career, what you thought, and being part of a cultural shift?
I've always thought that. Really, yeah. I have a great thing. Well, you know Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet. He got the Nobel Prize a few years ago, and I heard him being interviewed on the radio. The interviewer said, "What does it feel like to be famous?" He said, "Oh, well, in Ireland, everybody's famous." That's kind of the way I feel. I feel like I've always been on the edge of something and happy to be there. But when I was very young, the first records I listened to were the weirdest records. The ones I really liked were the strange ones. For instance, I love Duo. Now, I was living in... Do you know what Duo is? Yeah. Duo. What do you call it here? Duo. So, this music, when I first heard it as a young person, it could have been from Mars. And I realised that's what I like. I like things that sound like they were from Mars. I wanted newness all the time. It's called neophilia. I'm a neophilia. I always wanted to be listening to whatever felt strangers to me. Well, if you have that taste, then you go looking for it. You find it strange, and you try to understand why you like it. Two more.
Yeah, but
that's cheating.
yeah. What is the most powerful memory of your childhood?
Okay, that's quite easy because it was such a powerful memory. My uncle, this is before television, actually before horses. my uncle got hold of a little projector and he had a film and he didn't have a screen, so he set the projector up right next to the wall. It was about that far away, and he was showing this Disney film, and it was intensely bright. It was the brightest thing I'd ever seen, and incredibly colourful, and that made such a big impression. My parents told me, I talked about it for years afterwards, about those colours, and I know that was really why I became a painter, why I went to art school, because I wanted to have that feeling again. I wanted to try to make something as powerful as that. So that was my first really strong memory.
So, Brian, I have finished. I have a question for you. And what is your worst nightmare?
My worst nightmare. To be not counted on Trump.
What is this?
By the way, I think, just as an aside, I think Donald Trump might be the beginning of a real revolution against him. You know, I have a lot of American friends, a lot of scientists, West Coast sort of libertarians, really. And they always say to me, no, we don't do politics. Like politics is something similar to masturbating in a public place. It's like cool people don't do politics. And fuck me, they think differently now. Because, you know, you had two generations of people who didn't do politics. They didn't do it, but everybody else was still doing it. So now you see the result of that. So I think there's kind of a revolution going on in America now. There are two revolutions going on. There's the revolution that Trump represents, which is really the people's revolution. We didn't spot it because we thought it was going to be us who was doing the revolution. It wasn't. It was them. It was those other people. We didn't spot it. We weren't paying attention. Same in England, we weren't paying attention. We didn't know about those people. We didn't know about their lives. Well, now we do. And now we have to make our revolution. That really is important now. And suddenly I'm seeing all of these people who weren't interested in politics for the last 30 years. They're all talking politics. So I think that's good. And that's down to Trump. In a way, I'm glad he won because Hillary won. What would we have? We have the same old shit going on. Just like we've had for the last 30 years. We just have the graph still going up like that, and this one going down like that. So it's a dangerous strategy. My nightmare is that it fails. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. round of applause to the translator, who has by far the hardest job here.